My name is Michael Trapp. I'm the acting director of the Centre of Hellenic Studies here at King's. And in this capacity, it's my happy task to welcome you all to this year's Rumble Memorial Fund Lecture. Although it is a relatively new arrival, the Rumble Lecture has already established itself as one of the most enjoyable and lively annual events hosted by the CHS. But I should hurry to point out straight away that it is by no means simply a CHS event, quite apart from the fact that a huge proportion of the organisational work is done by my classics colleague Michael Squire. This is also a collaboration in which the Rumble Fund is supported by the Department of Classics and by London University's Institute of Classical Studies. And I should like to record our thanks here to these partners for their participation. Before I hand on to Michael to introduce this evening's lecturer, I have one other enjoyable task to perform. This is to draw your attention to this year's Rumble Fund trip, which saw 30 students of the Department of Classics spend 5 days in Greece at the Fund's expense in December to support their study of classical sculpture. The trip has been very nicely commemorated online, both on the Classics Department website and on social media, as these slides will show you. There is the whole group disporting itself. And there are some of the outputs. To give the participants an extra incentive to contribute to documenting the trip, there was a competition with prizes for the best image caption, and the best report. The competition was judged by our Dean of Faculty, Russell Goulburn, and I am now privileged to be able to announce the winners, hoping in the process to avoid any Oscars-style snarl-ups. The prize for the best image goes to Emily Underwood for this lovingly angled view of Hadrian's boyfriend Antinous. The prize for the best caption has been won by Ilona Hautama for this horribly persuasive insight into student life when you're late for your 9 a.m. And the prize for the best record goes again to Emily Underwood for this video diary, which you can enjoy on the Classics Department website. Can we please give these worthy winners a round of applause? Thank you very much. And with that, I can hand over to Michael Squire, who will say a few more words about the Rumble Fund itself and introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Well, I'm the second part of tonight's very brief warm-up act before we get to the main event with Liz Prettejohn's lecture. I promise that the warm-up itself won't delay things too much, but I want to say something first of all about the Jamie Rumble Fund and secondly about our 2017 Rumble lecturer. First then to the Jamie Rumble Memorial Fund itself. Now, even on a blossoming spring day like the one today, the landscape of British universities can at times seem rather bleak. Without launching into a party political broadcast, let's not let Brexit, Trump or Geert Wilders rain on our parade this evening, our political situation on this Ides of March 2017 may look equally overcast. For me, the ideas behind the Jamie Rumble Fund provide a little ray of sunshine, an opportunity to remember why we so love doing what we do here at King's. The Jamie Rumble Memorial Fund was founded in 2013 by an alumnus of our classical archaeology programme, and in recognition of our commitment here at King's to teaching Greek art and Roman art history, as indeed classical archaeology at large. It was named after a close personal friend of the donor, Jamie Rumble. Jamie was not at King's, nor indeed did he study classics. But Jamie was passionate about equal opportunities, that everyone should have the chance to fulfill their own unique potential. Jamie himself was a high flyer, a scholar at Cambridge, graduating with a first in 1990. He made a substantial difference to the lives of many, not least during his charity work in Zimbabwe and his work for Operation Raleigh. Sadly, Jamie's own life was cut short in February 1995 at the tender age of 26, not much older than many of the students here tonight, after a brave battle with pancreatic cancer. We at King's are very proud of the fund established in Jamie's memory, but I think Jamie would have been proud of it too, with its programme of broadening participation and enriching the student experience of so many here at King's. Indeed, it's a great tribute to the fund that so many Rumble students, both from this year and indeed from previous years, are joining us tonight. We at King's, staff and students alike, are hugely grateful to the Rumble Fund, and especially to the Rumble Fund donor who made this initiative possible. We're also grateful to Plurimi Capital, who charitably manage the fund on the department's behalf, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Oliver Ingram from Plurimi Capital tonight. Well, the Rumble Fund also brings me to the second part of this very brief warm-up act. While the chief purpose of the Rumble Fund is to support our annual module-led trip to classical lands, as Michael Trapp described earlier, another role of the fund is to host a large annual lecture, a chance to invite an international superstar from outside London here to the Great Hall and to share our passion and enthusiasm for classical art history. With that remit in mind, it's a very special privilege to introduce our 2017 Rumble lecturer, Professor Liz Prettejohn. Liz, in one sense, needs very little introduction. Her reputation as one of the most exciting art historians working in the UK very much precedes her, and I think helps to explain why there are so many of us here tonight, and indeed why so many couldn't get tickets to, through Eventbrite itself. Liz's research encompasses numerous fields, among them the relationship between art practice and philosophical aesthetics, the historiography of art, with a particular penchant for Walter Pater and Roger Fry, likewise the pre-Raphaelites, along with Victorian painting and sculpture at large, and last but not least, the afterlives of classical, medieval, and Renaissance visual culture, above all, though not exclusively, through the artistic lens of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Liz's formal training began at Harvard, but it was her MA that thankfully brought her to these shores, in fact to London itself, just next door to the Courthold, where Liz also pursued her PhD. Since completing her PhD in 1991, Liz has tracked a steady northern course across the country, with chairs first at Plymouth, then at Bristol, and most recently, since 2012, at the University of York, where she's Professor of the History of Art. Liz's range of monographs is no less impressive. Among others, over the last 2 decades, one might mention her volumes on Rossetti and his circle, her volumes on interpreting Sargent, the art of the pre-Raphaelites, a book on beauty and form from 1750 to 2000, a book on art for art's sake, aestheticism in Victorian painting, which was duly awarded the 2008 Historians of British Art Prize, and most recently in 2012, a book on the modernity of ancient sculpture, Greek sculpture and modern art, from Winkelmann to Picasso. One of the special aspects of Liz's work has been her collaboration with others. There are the edited books, of course, on Frederick Leighton, 1999, on Victorian art, 1999 too, on the Cambridge Companion to the Pre-Raphaelites in 2012, and indeed her hot-off-the-press recent book on Walter Pater, the classicist, a co-edited volume with Oxford University Press. But there are also numerous other collaborated, co-curated exhibitions, both in the UK and elsewhere, on the Pre-Raphaelites, on Waterhouse, on Rossetti, on Alma Tadema, and indeed on 19th century British responses to Rome. Liz's latest co-curated exhibition on Alma Tadema Classical Charm is currently jet-setting across the globe. After its autumn 2016 opening in the Frieze Museum, the show moved last month to Vienna and will land in Leighton House here in London from July to October this year. Londoners may be last in line when it comes to that Alma Tadema exhibition, but in the meantime, visitors to Leighton House can in fact find yet another of Liz's co-curated shows, which runs until next month. An exhibition on Flaming June, the making of an icon, centered, of course, around the fiery painting, which provided us with our image for tonight's poster. Well, I suspect we'll hear something more tonight about both Frederick Leighton and Lawrence Alma Tadema. But if the title, Beauty and Classical Form, is anything to go by, we'll hear much more besides. Liz is one of those all too rare art historians who manages to combine analysis of the microscale, whether dealing with a single artist, a single painting, or indeed a single brushstroke, with much broader cultural historical analysis. She's also someone who's managed to bridge that sadly all conspicuous and present divide between the study of Greek and Roman art history and the larger discipline. Throughout her work, Liz has drawn attention to the long and varied afterlife of Greek and Roman art. In doing so, she's also taken to task both classicists and art historians for their historicist parochialism. It's fair to say, I think, that more than any other scholar, Liz has crafted the reception of classical art as a self-standing, fully theorized field of critical inquiry and study. The name of the series in which her groundbreaking 2012 book on the modernity of ancient sculpture was published says it all: New Directions in Classics. Liz, on behalf of everyone here tonight, on behalf of the Institute of Classical Studies, the Department of Classics, and the Centre of Hellenic Studies, thank you for agreeing to be the 2017 Rumble Lecturer, and we hugely look forward to your talk tonight.
Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming and for hosting me at this event. And I'd like to say, above all, thanks to the Jamie Rumble Memorial Fund for the wonderful work that it's doing in supporting the study of classical art as such a vital element of our contemporary life. I hope to make a little contribution to that in my talk tonight. But I have set myself rather a daunting task. Beauty, classical, form, all of my keywords have come under heavy fire in recent times. Either they're derided as elitist and exclusionary, or they're patronized as soft-centered, romanticized, or even effeminate. You might say that the only word in my title that's uncontroversial is the and, but I'm afraid even that's not so. Is my and a comfortable conjunctive and, one that weaves a harmony between its terms, beauty and classical form? Or is it an edgy, disjunctive and, one that asserts a difference between beauty on the one hand and classical form on the other? I'm afraid that my and functions to a degree in that second disjunctive way. It's possible to define with logical and conceptual cogency what might be classical about a form. Here are some preliminary examples. On the left, a very early Greek sculpture of a male figure in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and therefore familiarly known as the New York Kouros. Truly a textbook example of the archaic style as it had developed by about 600 BC, with its symmetrical body forms, clearly marked musculature, arms pinned to the sides, incipient contrapposto with one foot just slightly advanced before the other, but little movement in the upper body. And on the right, a much later classical sculpture known as Pothos, or Desire, and associated with the sculptor Scopas of the 4th century BC, seen here in a supposed Roman copy of the 2nd century AD, and again, a textbook example of its type. The later sculptor bends and twists the body forms into a complex, flamboyantly asymmetrical pose and nuances the carving to imitate convincingly the round and supple forms of flesh. Both of these, different as they are, can be called textbook examples of classical form. And any responsible historian would be able to produce perfectly cogent reasons for describing them as such. That goes for the pioneering historian of ancient art, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, in 18th century Germany. It should be stressed that Winckelmann never saw either of these objects, both of which were underground until the 20th century. But he would have known exactly where to place them in the supremely logical historical scheme he devised, the one belonging to the earliest, most elemental archaic style, the other to the refined style associated with the 4th century BC. And it would still be the case for a historian of today who would be familiar with these and many other examples, and would still be able easily to identify the characteristics of their classical form, whether archaic or 4th century. Now, beauty is quite another matter. Oh dear. If you don't experience the Kouros as beautiful, then there's nothing I can say about it that will make you feel that thrill of delight. I could go on for hours about the purity and simplicity of the archaic form, about how exciting it is to sense that the stone figure is just beginning to move, to take his first step beyond the inert marble block. I could demonstrate the extraordinary technical prowess in cutting the beaded forms of the hair to result in symmetrical yet subtly graduated rows that seem to make the hard stone breathe and ripple. But if the archaic Kouros is not to your liking, there's nothing I can do to force you to take delight in it. If you find it too stiff, too hard, too primitive, you're in good company. For centuries, that's what the most well-educated and experienced connoisseurs would have thought, probably including Winkelmann, for whom the archaic style was immature and underdeveloped. If, on the other hand, you find the pothos effete in articulation or over-smooth in workmanship, you're in different company, but still perfectly good company. This is just the kind of thing that the modernist critic R.H. Walensky compared to a wax and India rubber figure for shop windows. So, critics from Winkelmann to Walensky would have been able to describe sculptures of both kinds as examples of classical form, whether or not they were moved by their beauty. Winkelmann actually used the term beautiful to describe the later classical style of the 4th century, and it's likely that he would have preferred the pothos to the New York Kouros. Walensky would certainly have been of the opposite view. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that there's no necessary relationship between being classical in form and being beautiful. And yet, from Winkelmann to Walensky, classical form comes somehow to the fore whenever critics or theorists try to speak of beauty. Walensky, it's true, is somewhat waspish about this and seems to resent the fact that he can't get away from classical form when he's trying to theorize the meaning of modern sculpture. That's the title to his book of 1932. Nonetheless, he writes about what he calls the Greek prejudice for a good 70 pages or so before he can clear the way for his main interest, the modern sculptor's creed. And even then, within a page or two, he's talking about Plato and what he calls beauty of form. And the simplified rhythmic forms of the modern sculptures he favors have something about them that we might be tempted to call classical in its way. This cover illustration features a sculpture of 1931 by Henry Moore. In this lecture, I want to explore the disjunctive and, the way it joins classical form to beauty at the same time as it puts them asunder. To do so, I concentrate on a historical moment between Winkelmann and Walensky, and on an artist who thought particularly deeply about these matters, Frederick Leighton. I take Leighton as a test case partly in celebration of the current exhibition at Leighton House Museum, which Michael mentioned. For just a couple more weeks until Saturday the 2nd of April, you can see this famous painting on loan from its home gallery in Puerto Rico, and I urge you to seize the opportunity. But there are other reasons, too, for paying special attention to Leighton in this context. So often he's been pigeonholed as the Victorian classical subject painter, the academic classicist, or the Victorian Olympian. I want to argue today that such pigeonholing is not just simplistic, but altogether wrong-headed. Leighton, as we shall see, was an exceptionally serious and indeed learned student of classical art at the period when both art history and classical archaeology were adventurous new disciplines. But Leighton was no antiquarian and no pedant. He was able to transform his deep understanding of classical form in ways that prove unexpectedly crucial to the theory and practice of modern art and modernism. To pursue this argument, I want to puzzle through in some detail a key statement of Leighton's about his own art. By degrees, however, my growing love for form made me intolerant of the restraint and exigencies of costume, and led me more and more, and finally to a class of subjects, or more accurately to a set of conditions, in which supreme scope is left to pure artistic qualities, in which no form is imposed upon the artist by the tailor, but in which every form is made obedient to the conception of the design he has in hand. These conditions classic subjects afford, and as vehicles, therefore, of abstract form, which is a thing not of one time but of all time, these subjects can never be obsolete, and though to many they are a dead letter, they can never be an anachronism. This passage has routinely been cited in all the standard texts on Victorian classicism, but its implications have scarcely been examined. It comes from a letter dated 27 November 1873 and written by Leighton in answer to an inquiry from the art critic Joseph Cummins Carr. Leighton is explaining to Carr the change in his artistic practice over the previous decade, a change that moved away from works that John Ruskin might have called Gothic, and that we might loosely term pre-Raphaelite or Romantic. A particularly sumptuous example of that Gothic type is Leighton's Dante in Exile of 1864, where the restraint and exigencies of costume are turned to advantage, both in relation to characterization, the saturnine Dante in the center, the mannered minstrel, the beautiful youth and elegant lady amidst a panoply of courtiers, and in relation to sheer painterly exuberance, the red on red of the minstrel's cloak, the heavy brocades, folded, twisted, and rippling silks, not to mention such accessory details as the ribbons that secure the youthful male's doublet and hose. For bravura costume painting, this is hard to match. Another example might be Leighton's David of 1865, where the figure's face looks like a portrait, and the characterization is completed by a gold earring, clenched hands, and swathes of dark drapery that express a mood but conceal the body beneath. Even the massive beard reads as a kind of costume that conceals the bodily shapes of chin and neck beneath. You could scarcely argue that this painting lacks form in the sense of design or composition. The diagonals of the profile and beard and the mass of dark drapery are expertly counterpointed against the craggy mountain landscape and the dramatic light effect in the cloudy sky, with the horizontal parapet as a stabilizing element. But Leighton means something else when he speaks of his growing love for form, to which he gives a capital F. At first, he links it to a class of subjects, then corrects himself to speak of a set of conditions. He does go on to mention classic subjects, and the passage has usually been interpreted as referring primarily to his espousal of classical subject matter as the 1860s wore on, in a sequence we might trace from Orpheus and Eurydice of 1864 through to Daedalus and Icarus of 1869. But I think we should take Leighton's self-correction seriously and not reduce the question to mere subject matter. So we might stay with biblical subjects and trace the shift from David in 1865 to the picture on the right, Jonathan's token to David of 1868. A closely related set of biblical characters, but an altogether different set of conditions, as the voluminous draperies and strong facial characterization of the first painting are replaced by the idealized male body and noble profile with minimal expression of the second. We could compare that face to any one of a number of ancient sculptured heads. As a broad generalization, we've moved from the world of painting in the David, with its strong recollection of a Venetian male portrait, a Titian, Tintoretto, or Veronese, to the world of sculpture in the second. Leighton is moving backwards in time of visual reference, from painting, the art form that the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel called romantic, to sculpture, the classical art form par excellence in the Jonathan of 1868. This is an anachronistic move within the framework of the modern art world of the 1860s, but it is a deliberate one. Leighton knows exactly what he's doing when he moves backwards from romantic to classical. It should by now be clear, though, that the famous backwards shift, which Leighton elsewhere calls the passage from Gothicism to classicism, that can't be reduced to a simple question of subject matter. Neither, though, can it be described as simplistic accounts of Victorian aestheticism often have done, as an abandonment of subject matter in favor of pure form. True, the first painting has a definite subject, elucidated in traditional fashion by a catalogue quotation. "Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then I would fly away and be at rest." These words from Psalm 55 characterize the melancholic figure, but they're also illustrated along another compelling diagonal, so we can trace David's gaze upwards and to the right, to the two doves wheeling into the distance. This is a very painterly scene, with light breaking through trails of cloud and catching the feathers of the dove's wings. The second painting also represents a biblical story from 1 Samuel, where Jonathan goes out to the field and shoots 3 arrows as a sign to David in hiding. The poet Algernon Charles Swinburne, not normally an enthusiast for Leighton's painting, made exception for this one and wrote, "The majestic figure and noble head of Jonathan are worthy of the warrior whose love was wonderful, passing the love of women." That succinctly captures the change in emphasis. David, the figure represented in the earlier painting, is not physically present here, but he is the focus of attention or of longing, a focus that is invisible, but imaginatively crucial to the way the picture works. And if David is no longer the subject matter represented in the picture, he is in some sense its form, for Jonathan's body and pose mimic that of Michelangelo's David. I think it's important that the point of visual reference is sculptural, and indeed it's just possible that Leighton has slightly corrected the contrapposto of his Renaissance prototype in the direction of the classical. Rather than the far-flung, even slightly balletic loose leg of Michelangelo's David, Leighton uses a more contained pose reminiscent of the Leighton types that were just coming to the attention of classical archaeologists in the 1860s. I'm showing you on the right the version of the diadumenos discovered at Vaison in 1862 and acquired by Leighton's friend Charles Newton for the British Museum in 1869. And I think there may be another point of reference in Leighton's very learned construction of a classical body here, one that's relevant to Leighton's attempt to do away with the tailor. Leighton half undresses his figure, and he also experiments with the clothing to make it reveal rather than conceal the body. The decorated shirt resembles the cuirasse esthétique, molded to the musculature of the torso, as in the St. Michael that we now know is a work by Piero della Francesca, which entered the National Gallery in 1867, just at the moment that Leighton was working on his painting of Jonathan. This isn't just a game of spot the source, and the picture can't simply be shrugged off as eclectic. Leighton has not given up expressing a serious content, but he no longer wants to do that through facial expression, characterization, costume, or narrative details. He wants to do it through form, and that means gathering in all the visual resources that the art of the past has made available to him. Let's keep our attention a little longer on this fascinating and complex moment in the later 1860s. This is the moment of Walter Pater's essay, Winckelmann, first published in 1867, and a key text in the development of classical art history. Pater's essay is a sustained exploration not only of how Winckelmann had set the study of Greek art on its way in his pioneering writings of the mid-18th century, but also of how Winckelmann's ideas had since reverberated through the thought of Goethe and Hegel. Crucially, Pater concludes by asking what all this reflection on Greek art might mean for modernity and for modern art. Perhaps it's not a coincidence, then, that this is also the moment of the emergence of what has so often been called the Victorian classical revival or Victorian classical subject painting. That phrase has become a catch-all term for anything with subject matter from classical antiquity, and indeed there was a proliferation, evident by the middle 1860s, of classical subjects in British painting. Anything from Roman soldiers to women in amphitheaters, characters from Greek mythology, decadent emperors, genre scenes set in ancient Greece or Rome, and what have you. I want to isolate from this hodgepodge something more precise and specific that's better described, I think, in the phrase classical form. I'll go one step further and say that I've come to think that classical subject painting is not an analytically distinct category for works of art made in this period. That is, the artworks that fall within it are not different from the works that fall outside it in ways that have any explanatory force. But it does make sense to speak of an approach to form, as Leighton spells it with a capital F, that first materializes and is first theorized in the 1860s, and that leads genealogically, not teleologically, to what's familiar to art historians as the modernist formalism of Roger Fry, Clive Bell, and Clement Greenberg in the 20th century. Genealogically, not teleologically. That qualification is important. The historiography of modern art has been plagued by what seems an inexorable teleological drive towards abstraction. That's surely an ideological mystification, as so many critics have pointed out, and yet its tenacity, despite the attempts of all those critics to eradicate it, suggests that there's something in it to reckon with. Notice that Leighton, in his letter to Commons Carr, is already speaking of abstract form, although we should hold in suspension what he might mean by that. Assuredly, he is not prophesying a Mondrian, difficult as it may be for us to rid our own visual memories of 20th century conceptions of abstraction. I think there is, however, a genealogical, not a teleological line worth tracing. One place to start is with the extraordinary review of the Royal Academy exhibition of 1867 by Sidney Colvin, a recent Cambridge graduate just beginning what would become a glittering career in the later 19th century art world. Unusually for this date, Colvin begins with a theoretical justification for his evaluation of the 700 or so artists in the exhibition. And he writes, "Pictorial art addresses itself directly to the sense of sight, to the emotions and the intellect only indirectly through the medium of the sense of sight. The only perfection of which we can have direct cognizance through the sense of sight is the perfection of forms and colors. Therefore, perfection of forms and colors, beauty in a word, should be the prime object of pictorial art. Having this, it has the chief requisite, and spiritual, intellectual beauty are contingent on this, are something thrown into the bargain." Colvin's statement sounds startlingly like some later formulations, for example, of Roger Fry, that are routinely dubbed formalist. And that's no coincidence. As Slade Professor and Director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, Colvin set the agenda for the study of the visual arts at Cambridge, where he remained until 1885, the year Fry began his undergraduate career. I think there's a Cambridge genealogy for formalism of a certain kind, and it's important that this kind of formalism is linked to a very serious scholarly study of the art of the past based on comparison using the new technologies of photography and the lantern slide. Another important element is the collection of casts of ancient sculptures, a key project of Colvin's in the later 1870s and early 1880s. This is a forgotten part of the history of art history and one that's crying out for further research. For now, I can only suggest how close the relations were among scholarly art history, the theorization of a formalist aesthetics, and contemporary art practice at this complex moment. To return to Colvin's review of 1867, after stating his proto-formalist principle for evaluation, Colvin goes on to name a tiny number of artists whose work satisfies his criterion, perfection of forms and colors. And he begins with Leighton, Albert Moore, and James McNeill Whistler. I'm showing you three works from the exhibition that Colvin was reviewing. Leighton's Spanish Dancing Girl on the left, Moore's The Musicians on the top right, and Whistler's Symphony in White No. 3. In his review, Colvin refers to the classical ideal, and the classicism of these pictures seems better characterized in Leighton's phrase as a set of conditions rather than a class of subjects. I think Leighton's phraseology is exact. The contents of these pictures, the draped figures and their precisely measured surroundings, are vehicles of abstract form where abstract does not have its 20th century connotation of non-representationality. What then does it imply? These works all involve experimentation around ideas of formal repetition with an implied analogy between visual form and music or rhythm. There's nothing to stop the viewer from free association with all manner of ideas, but also nothing to enforce a particular train of thought. Instead, the pictures ask us to attend, as one might to a piece of music, to dwell on what we see. As Colvin says of Moore, with him, form goes for nearly everything, expression for next to nothing. This describes an order of priorities, one that's deeply rooted in philosophical aesthetics. It recalls a passage from the 22nd of Friedrich Schiller's Aesthetic Letters. In a truly successful work of art, the contents should effect nothing, the form everything, for only through the form is the whole man affected. Through the subject matter, by contrast, only one or other of his functions. And much later, the phraseology would recur in Walter Pater's discussion of Plato's inheritance from the philosophers of the past in his book of 1893, Plato and Platonism. But then, writes Pater, in the creation of philosophical literature, as in all other products of art, form, in the full signification of the word, is everything, and the mere matter is nothing. Leighton also says that abstract form is a thing not of one time, but of all time, a point I'll come back to. It's worth noting, though, that it fits the pictures we're looking at, which seem to take their design cue from the sculptures of Greek antiquity. I'm showing you some of the sculptures in the east pediment of the Parthenon, surely an inspiration for all three artists at this date. Not only in Whistler's enigmatic combination of Japanese accessories, Regency dresses, and modern hairstyles, but in the more consistently classical settings of Leighton and Moore, there's a reluctance or even a refusal to pinpoint a specific historical moment through fashion or period style. In this context, the distinction between classical drapery and costume comes to seem crucial. One element in this is clearly the determination to make the human body in its visible aspect the bearer of the expressive or aesthetic import. I see this as a serious attempt on Leighton's part to realize Hegel's classical art form, in which there is entire unity between the idea or spiritual content and its embodiment in the three-dimensional human body. For obvious reasons, a sculpture of an ideal human figure is the best representative of the classical art form, which remains closely tied to pagan antiquity in Hegel's grand historical scheme. Walter Pater puts the idea succinctly in his essay of 1867 on Winckelmann. But take a work of Greek art, the Venus of Melos. That is in no sense a symbol, a suggestion of anything beyond its own victorious fairness. The mind begins and ends with the finite image, yet loses no part of the spiritual motive. This motive is not lightly and loosely attached to the sensuous form as its meaning to an allegory, but saturates and is identical with it. This helps to explain Leighton's impatience with the tailor. He wants the body itself to convey the whole message of the work without relying on the anecdotal or illustrative details that clothes or accessories might produce. Much attention's been paid to the riskiness of presenting the nude figure at the Victorian public exhibition, and Leighton was fearless in this respect. He was the first of his generation to present serious, large-scale nudes at the Royal Academy and of both sexes, the female Venus disrobing for the bath in 1867, and then the male in Daedalus and Icarus of 1869. Later in life, he used his considerable power in the art world to oppose unflinchingly any attempt to suppress or censor the nude figure at exhibition or in art education. I think this is worth mentioning, since it's so often assumed that the classical is always on the side of conservative or establishment values. In the 19th century, the classical nude could still be socially and politically emancipatory. But there's more to the question of nudity versus clothes, or in Leighton's terms, the artist versus the tailor, and it's enough to cite Thomas Carlyle's wacky novel, Sartor Resartus, The Tailor Retailored, to remind us of the connection to German idealist philosophy. The binary pair, body and clothes, makes an exceptionally supple or flexible figure for other binaries, such as form and matter, form and content, or in the case of the visual arts, form and color. One critic for whom Leighton's devotion to the nude body was perplexing was John Ruskin. I have no right whatever to speak of the work of higher effort and claim which have been the result of Leighton's acutely observant and enthusiastic study of the organism of the human body. I am indeed able to recognize his skill, but have no sympathy with the subjects that admit of its display. To demonstrate the better qualities of Leighton's art, Ruskin produces for his audience two delicate drawings from the very beginning of his career, before his shift to the classical. One, a pencil drawing of a Byzantine well head, the other, the famous drawing of a lemon tree made on Capri in 1859. Both of these are stunning displays of technical skill and compositional elegance, but with no human figure. It would be easy enough to dismiss this move of Ruskin's as an extreme or eccentric example of the moral or sexual discomfort with the nude so often attributed to the Victorians. But even if that is the case, Ruskin has something more in view. The context is the third lecture in Ruskin's series of 1883 on the art of England, the lecture ostensibly devoted to classic schools of painting, but in fact structured around a large-scale opposition between Gothic and classic that turns precisely on clothes. Ruskin begins with a standard issue characterization of classical art, something like diluted Winckelmann, and he says, "You find from the earliest times in Greece and Italy a multitude of artists gradually perfecting the knowledge and representation of the human body glorified by the exercises of war." Then he introduces Northern art, seemingly by way of contrast. He refers to innumerably and incorrigibly savage nations who delight in tinting or scratching on stones and bones and logs, never attaining any skill in figure drawing. They dream and blunder on through the centuries. Yet somehow Ruskin's fable takes a turn and, quote, in due course we get a Holbein out of them, and in the end, for best product hitherto, Sir Joshua and the supremely Gothic Gainsborough. Somehow, a reversal of values has taken place. The heroic classical body has come to seem overblown, and the northern paintings delightful for the supposedly superficial element of costume. So Ruskin writes, suppose now, under the instigation of Mr. Carlyle and Sartor, and under the counsel of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, we had it really in our power to bid Sir Joshua and Gainsborough paint all these over again in the classic manner. Would you really insist on having her white frock taken off the age of innocence, and on the blue boy's divesting himself of his blue, and on, we may not dream of anything more classic, Mrs. Graham's taking the feathers out of her hat, and on Lord Heathfield's parting, I dare not suggest with his regimentals, but his orders of the bath, or what else? The clothes, as Ruskin is at pains to acknowledge, are the superficial element. Frillings and trimmings, he calls them, cuffs and collarettes. Yet the listener or reader is in no doubt that a reversal of values has occurred, and Ruskin is delighting in the art of the tailor. The superficial has taken the moral high ground. Ruskin's lecture reads as engagingly batty, but he has a deceptively firm grip on the conceptual structure, based on large-scale oppositions between the Gothic and the classic, the clothes and the body. The two antitheses seem parallel, but which term is the essential, which the superficial? The very energy of the vocabulary with which Ruskin declares the superficiality of the Gothic and the clothes turns the tables and persuades the hearer that the moral weight is, after all, on the other side. That's for Ruskin, not for Leighton, and it's worth noting that Leighton's Academy addresses, delivered biennially from 1879 onwards, and therefore contemporary with Ruskin's lectures on the art of England, take a determinedly anti-Ruskinian position, particularly in their forthright and uncompromising rejection of an ethical or moral aim for art. That's a topic for another day, but one aspect is worth emphasizing. Ruskin is concerned with a national art, as his title, The Art of England, indicates. He's also the author of Modern Painters, and the concern with clothes, fashion, and nationality bears comparison with Baudelaire's famous essay on the painter of modern life. Leighton's lectures, on the other hand, are thoroughly international and cosmopolitan. He deals confidently with Islamic, Egyptian, and Assyrian art, and although the series was curtailed by his death in 1895, its scope and ambition were to deal with the art of all times and places. Remember his remark in the letter to Carr that about form as a thing not of one time, but of all time. In this respect, Leighton's addresses prefigure Roger Fry's Slade Lecture series at Cambridge in 1933-34, also curtailed by his death and later published as Last Lectures. Leighton's lectures seem to belong with the Cambridge art historical tradition to which I referred earlier, from Colvin to Fry, devoted to pure form and consistently opposed to Ruskin's Oxford moralism. Ruskin represents a 19th century modernity, nationalistic and romantic, or as he puts it, Gothic. But it's Leighton's classical form that, in my view, contributes to the theorization of artistic modernism. It has a cosmopolitan origin in Leighton's unusual artistic training, first in Frankfurt under a member of the Nazarene Circle, then in Rome and Paris. And Leighton's artistic outlook remained thoroughly cosmopolitan, opposed to nationalism in principle and in artistic practice. This is an important point, as there is a knee-jerk tendency to accuse every eminent Victorian of buying into nationalist and imperialist ideologies. Not so in Leighton's case. His Academy addresses show him to be an internationalist of the most committed kind, and that's central to his artistic practice as well as to the broadly Hegelian art theory and art history of the addresses. A good example would be Leighton's Elijah and the Wilderness, which made its debut at the Exposition Universelle held in Paris in 1878, and to which the English critic and former pre-Raphaelite brother F.G. Stevens had this nonplussed response. It is difficult to know in what category to place Mr. Leighton's works. They are dissimilar to any English work. We suppose they may be taken as cosmopolitan. Leighton's Elijah is a work of towering ambition, clearly meant to stake a claim for international preeminence at the exhibition of all the world's nations. It measures more than 2 meters in either dimension, and the biblical subject makes no concessions to popular taste or fashionability. We see the prophet Elijah at the moment of his greatest despair, cast out into the wilderness, exhausted and longing for death. He has not yet glimpsed the angel who comes to give him food and drink. This corresponds to a striking moment in the oratorio Elijah by Felix Mendelssohn, just after Elijah cries out to the Lord, "It is enough," a moment of stillness when the angels begin to sing the hauntingly beautiful trio, "Lift up thine eyes unto the hills." I'm quite certain that Leighton meant his painting to recall this moment in Mendelssohn's music to viewers' memories. As in the examples we saw earlier, the body is the vehicle of expression. The bearded face is scarcely visible, which leaves the rugged musculature of the body to convey the force of the prophet's character. And again, the visible forms conjure up memories of the art of the past. The torso may be seen as a free imitation of the Barberini faun. Perhaps with the leaner chest and tenser musculature, Leighton transforms the connotations of the faun's exhaustion after sensual revelry to suit the different contexts of Elijah's exhaustion after religious struggle. At the same time, the body and legs recall Michelangelo, and perhaps particularly the Christ of the unfinished entombment that entered the National Gallery in 1868. The rude strength of the pagan body is united with Christian pathos to characterize this Old Testament prophet. Perhaps there's also an echo of that Michelangelo in the rocky background and subdued coloring, a sublime effect, intensified in the Leighton by the dramatic point of view and luminous sky. The figure of the angel serves as a foil, an element of pure beauty, like the angels trio in Mendelssohn's oratorio. It was later in the same year, 1878, that Leighton was elected president of the Royal Academy, and from this point he began increasingly to be described as an academic classicist. That also reflects the success of such paintings as Elijah in the Wilderness in the international arena of the Exposition Universelle. And British critics started to compare Leighton to the French artists seen as upholders of academic tradition, Bouguereau and Cabanel. Yet, I have the same reservations about the category academic classicism as I expressed earlier about Victorian classical subject painting. Belonging to or even being president of an academy does not create an analytically distinct category, and the recidivist tendency to pigeonhole 19th century artists as either academic or avant-garde has vitiated too much art historical writing on the period. Leighton's classical form is nothing like Bouguereau's Baroque or Rococo exuberance of spiraling composition coupled with a heightened level of detail that reads as photographic in its realism. This example is Bouguereau's Birth of Venus of 1879, the year after Leighton's Elijah appeared in Paris. Or take Cabanel's Phèdre of the next year. full of impeccably researched antiquarian detail and theatrical in presentation, appropriately so in relation to Racine's play of the same title, a major monument of French literary classicism that's surely being invoked here. But again, not much like Leighton's classical form. Indeed, both the Bouguereau and the Cabanel look very nationalistically French in comparison to Leighton's Cosmopolitan painting. Leighton's work, I think, is closer to other artists whose commitments were to classical form. I suggest comparison to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, or even Cézanne, the classicist in everything but subject matter. I'm showing here a still life particularly favored by Roger Fry to suggest that the qualities of design, color, and lighting could reasonably be described using the phrase we're exploring today, classical form. Of course, Leighton, president of the Royal Academy, was nothing like the reclusive Provençal artist in art world role or standing. Yet there is something strangely similar. Like Cézanne, Leighton was always a painter's painter, never widely popular in his lifetime, although he commanded respect from artists. Walter Sickert, for example, refers to Leighton repeatedly in his art criticism as the touchstone for something he calls quality in art. Of Leighton's work at the Exposition Universelle of 1878, including Elijah, one critic wrote, "They compel our admiration, but they do not sway our hearts." And this kind of critical comment is fairly typical. The idea might, however, be translated into the aesthetic terminology of the immediately succeeding generation. Leighton's classical form inspires, and is meant to inspire in the viewer, not the emotions of life, but rather what Clive Bell, in his book Art of 1913, termed the aesthetic emotion. Let me be clear about the argument I'm making. I'm not claiming that Leighton, rather than Manet or Cézanne, was the true father of modern art. I am, however, calling attention to the forgotten role of classical form, and with it the 19th century study of classical art in the genealogy that leads to modernism in art practice and formalism in art theory. We might return to the three artists selected by Colvin back in the 1860s. I'm showing Leighton's A Girl with a Basket of Fruit of 1863, Whistler's Little White Girl of 1865, and Albert Moore's A Venus of 1869. All three of these are representational paintings that feature the human figure. And all three of them take their cue to a significant extent from Greek sculpture, which we know all three artists were studying at this period. But they are not exactly classical subject paintings. Moore's title, A Venus, seems to imply that this is not the Venus of classical mythology, but rather a Venus, a work of art. And none of the three paintings depends on anecdotal or narrative expressiveness for its effect. Nor does it seem adequate to call them academic classicism. They are better described as explorations of abstract form, in the sense Leighton used the phrase in 1863, or what I've been calling classical form. I'll just pause before concluding to alert you to the exhibition on Albert Moore that will open on the 7th of April in York Art Gallery, my hometown. If you are intrigued by the austere, formal beauty of Moore's classical figures, don't miss that exhibition. Beauty, there's that word. The word that somehow mysteriously keeps recurring, unbidden, whenever classical form is at issue. I'd like to conclude with a painting that raises the questions of beauty and classical form with particular intensity, Flaming June. Again, I remind you that you have until the 2nd of April to see it at Leighton House Museum. I urge you to visit, or to visit again if you've already seen it. This is likely to be the only chance in our lifetimes to see the painting in the studio house for which it was made, where it was made. Does this painting have a classical subject? Most critics of 1895, when it was first exhibited at the Royal Academy, felt confident about calling it Greek. But despite a few minimal indications of a Mediterranean setting, its Greekness seems a matter of form rather than narrative or expression. Part of the picture's fascination is a face that's beautiful without having any character at all. The absence of expression is hard won. It's not at all straightforward to make a face that partakes no more of one emotion than another, that's neither happy nor sad, woeful nor hopeful, wistful nor willful. A feminist objection might be that this deprives the female figure of her subjectivity, but I don't think that gender is the most important issue here. What's more important is that this is classical and deliberately so. As Walter Pater wrote of Greek sculpture in the Winkelmann essay back in 1867, to all but the highest culture, the reserved faces of the gods will ever have something of insipidity. In Flaming June, the face is the thinnest and most evanescent part of the painted surface, seeming almost to vanish into its own dream world, and it is the whole body that carries the expressive weight. Leighton is still thinking about ancient sculpture, the Discobolus with its coiled pose, together perhaps with late 5th century relief sculpture for the drapery and the foot peeping from the hem. And again, he unites classical with Renaissance sculptural form as though to encourage our imaginations to roam through the history of art, seeking associations. Comparisons often been made to Michelangelo's Night, but I think the Nudity of the Sistine Chapel are equally important. Leighton seems to condense the experimentation with twisting and turning bodies in the sequence of a nudity into a single body. And although that body is clearly female, there's also a sense of the human body abstracted beyond all differentiation of sex, so its forms look just as much like the male in nudity as like the female knight. And we should not forget the massive body forms of the Parthenon sculptures, casts of which Leighton kept around himself in his studio. Flaming June helps us to see the transhistorical affinity between Michelangelo and Phidias, not a historical relationship, of course, since Michelangelo never saw the Parthenon sculptures. So Leighton's exploration of classical form is both learned and creative. He shows how the art of the classical and Renaissance past can be reconfigured to create new forms for modern art. He's acutely conscious that he cannot just go back to the Renaissance or to the Greeks. He is a modern artist, and his medium is modern oil paint in full color, the hallmark, finally, of Hegel's romantic art form, the form that irrevocably supersedes the classical in the art of modernity. The critics of 1895 struggled to find a vocabulary adequate to the endless profusion of differentiated oranges. Topaz yellow, apricot gold, rosy orange, amber, saffron, old gold, brick dust, and of course, flame-colored. Nothing like this array can be found in the art of the past, and it draws on every resource of modern chemistry, as well as a color sense scarcely conceivable before Delacroix. Classical, Renaissance, modern. Leighton's immensely learned painting makes a very good lesson in art history, and in Hegelian art theory to boot. But is it beautiful? A strict academic classicist might say, if the painting displays classical form, then you ought logically to find it beautiful. Or perhaps you're even morally obliged to find it beautiful. But remember that disjunctive "and" I mentioned at the outset. Even if I've persuaded you that the painting displays classical form, I can't force you to experience the thrill of beauty, the kind of thrill that Winkelmann felt when he contemplated the Apollo Belvedere, for instance. But perhaps there's another way to think about it. When Leighton makes silent reference to the art of the past, he is inviting us to see the beauty of classical form, to give free play to our imaginations in recalling the mutilated sculptures of the Parthenon or the colossal bodies of the Sistine ceiling in the coiled pose or the endlessly rippling draperies. And by the same token, when I call this painting beautiful, I am inviting you to engage in a free play of imagination and thought around the ideas of classical form, of musicality and rhythm, of pathos and strength. It's such a free play that produces that thrill, simultaneously sensuous and intellectual, that we associate with the beautiful. You may, of course, choose to decline that invitation, and indeed your freedom to do so is crucial. If there were some rule or precept by which I could enforce my judgment upon you, we'd be talking about academic classicism, and not about the kind of experience that Winckelmann had when he contemplated the Apollo Belvedere, the experience that made his breast seem to swell with the spirit of prophecy and which transported him in imagination to the groves of Apollo.
My name is Hugh Bowden. I'm the head of the Department of Classics here, and I'm very conscious that I am all that is standing between you and the drinks reception beyond those doors. But I want to hold you here for a couple of minutes so that I can say two things. The first is to say something from my perspective as the head of department of the effect of the Rumble Fund and the Rumble Trip on our students. I see the students before they go and after they come back, and I'm very conscious of the transformation that the experience of going on the Rumble Trip has on our students year after year. And we're extremely grateful to the donor and to Plurimi Capital for making this possible, for giving our students this exceptional and wonderful opportunity to experience the classical world. And of course, every year I have the privilege of coming and listening to the Jamie Rundle Memorial Lecture. And that too is always transformative. We've had a brilliant series of lectures which seem to get better and better every year as we get to see classical art, the classical world transformed, revisioned by the context in which speakers put it. And this year's lecture was a particularly brilliant example of how to do this. I will certainly be heading off to Leighton House, which is closed on Tuesdays, by the way, before the 2nd of April, and I will be back there from the 7th of June to see Alma Tadema, who sort of got overlooked in today's talk, but will be there in all his 130 paintings worth of glory in the 7th of July. So that I did know that. Yes, I will be doing that, but I will also never be able to look at Flaming June or any other of Leighton's other paintings in quite the same way again from having learnt so much from this evening. So I want to thank Liz Prettejohn again, and then when the applause dies down, invite you to step outside to find the refreshments that are awaiting you there.